The way Augustus built the Roman Empire is eerily similar to how modern empires rise and fall today. Political maneuvering, military strategy, and clever use of propaganda, the same tactics he used to silence his rivals and secure his power, are still at play in global politics today. Augustus didn't just change the course of history. He set the blueprint for how power would be seized, maintained, and consolidated for centuries. And now we're living in a world where these very tactics still shape the leaders we follow. Think about it. What we understand about leadership today is deeply rooted in the lessons Augustus taught over 2,000 years ago. So, what can we learn from him, and how will that knowledge influence our future? Before we dive deeper into the shocking rise of Augustus, here's something to consider. The methods he used to secure his power are eerily similar to how modern leaders maintain control today. But do we truly recognize the signs? If you're ready to uncover the manipulative genius behind the creation of an empire and how it still shapes our world, make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay with us. Trust me, you don't want to miss how Augustus' story will change the way you see leadership and power. Let's get started. Let's strip away the polished veneer of Augustus and see the man behind the myth. Imagine this: a teenager still in his teens, thrust into the political chaos of Rome after Julius Caesar's assassination, a cauldron of ambition, backstabbing, and political violence. But here's the real shocker. Augustus wasn't just the heir to Caesar. He was the one who shaped his own future by orchestrating Caesar's assassination. Think about it. Without the power vacuum left by Caesar's death, Augustus would have been just another young noble with no clear path to power. He didn't simply step into the gap, he created it. He carefully manipulated the Senate, used the image of Caesar's legacy to his advantage, and systematically eliminated any threat to his claim, one betrayal at a time. Here's what no one tells you. Augustus was not a pragmatist who inherited power. He was a genius of power. He understood people, manipulated them. The Senate thought they had control, but Augustus never allowed them to understand what he was truly after. He didn't just break the Roman Republic. He turned it into a puppet show where he was the sole puppeteer. His alliances? Strategic. His public persona? A facade. He didn't just restore the old order. He turned it into something he controlled entirely. What Augustus did wasn't just make peace. He redefined what peace meant, ensuring that no one could ever challenge his absolute rule again. Let's talk about the power vacuum after Caesar's death. Most historians will tell you that Rome was in chaos, and Augustus stepped in. But the truth is darker. Augustus created that chaos. He watched as the political leaders of Rome tore each other apart. And when Mark Antony tried to challenge him, he didn't just defeat him in battle, he destroyed his reputation, poisoning public opinion and using propaganda in a way that no one had ever seen before. Cleopatra and Antony were portrayed as the ultimate enemies of Rome, but in reality, Augustus was the true enemy of the Republic. He didn't just defeat his rivals in the battlefield, he crushed them politically, psychologically, and socially. And the greatest myth ever told about Augustus? That his reign marked the end of civil war and the start of peace. The Pax Romana was not a gift from a benevolent ruler. No, it was a product of Augustus' ability to crush any dissent with brutal precision. Every province he expanded, it was either under his direct control or eliminated if it refused to bow. His reign wasn't a time of peace, it was a time of fear. Fear that if you opposed Augustus, you'd vanish, just like the countless political rivals he erased from history. His reign was defined by control, not benevolence. So, why does this matter today? Because Augustus' methods of manipulating power are still in practice. How often do we see leaders who rise on the backs of public opinion, making us think they're one of us, only to consolidate absolute control once they're in power? Augustus wasn't just an emperor, he was a master of image. His legacy teaches us that the most dangerous rulers aren't the ones who come in with a sword, they're the ones who come in with a smile, make you believe they're one of the people, and then slowly erase the structures that hold them accountable. This is the true story of Augustus, a man who didn't just navigate the political landscape, he reinvented it to serve his will, and in doing so he created an empire that would last for centuries. The methods he used weren't just effective, they were ruthless. The next time you hear about Augustus being the savior of Rome, remember, he wasn't saving Rome, he was replacing it with something far more dangerous. And now ask yourself, could it happen again? Could we be watching the rise of another Augustus? Someone who masters the art of control without anyone even realizing it until it's too late? Did you know that one man's rise to power shaped the future of the Western world for over 2,000 years? Augustus, the founder of the Roman Empire, didn't just secure a throne. He reshaped the very foundation of governance, warfare, and culture. Yet, most people think of him as merely a political figurehead. But here's the twist. Under his reign, a system of governance that balanced the fragile line between monarchy and republic was born, and it's still influencing our leaders today. Imagine, without Augustus, there would have been no Roman Empire, no Pax Romana, no lasting legacy. But what if his power wasn't solidified by military might? What if, instead, it was all about perception and cunning political strategy? Stick around, because the truth of Augustus will change how you see modern leadership forever. Let's challenge everything you think you know about Augustus, the so-called first emperor of Rome. Picture this. A young man barely out of his teens with no real military experience, suddenly thrust into the chaos of a dying republic. Was Augustus the heir to Caesar's legacy? Or was he the opportunist who saw a dying empire and grabbed it by the throat? Augustus didn't simply inherit power, he manufactured it. He didn't just play the political game, he rewrote the rules to serve his own ends. Let's tear away the myth of Augustus as the rightful heir, and look at the true story. Augustus didn't just have family connections. He crafted those connections, exploited them, and used them as a shield to shield his ambitions. Here's a fact you won't hear often. Augustus wasn't Caesar's heir because Caesar loved him. He was Caesar's heir because Caesar saw something in the young Octavian, a cold, calculating figure who would be malleable in the right hands. When Caesar was assassinated, it wasn't fate that handed Augustus the empire. It was Augustus' decades-long strategy to manipulate, divide, and conquer every obstacle that stood in his path. Think about it. Without Caesar's death, there is no Augustus. No Pax Romana. No Roman Empire. The public narrative is that Augustus inherited Caesar's political legacy, but the reality is darker. What if I told you that Augustus not only accepted Caesar's inheritance but set up the stage for Caesar's murder? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Augustus created the very chaos that gave him the opportunity to rise. After Caesar's assassination, the young Octavian had no choice but to fight for his survival. His youth, inexperience, and lack of direct military power made him an easy target for Rome's elites. But Augustus was no fool. He knew that survival didn't lie in just military victories, it lay in mastering the art of perception. By the time he stepped onto the Roman stage, he had already learned the most valuable lesson of all. The true power of politics lies in controlling the narrative. Now let's talk about Asia. History often presents her as a supportive mother, quietly guiding her son through the turbulence of Roman politics. But this image is far from the reality. Asia was a mastermind behind the scenes. She understood the rules of Roman politics better than most men at the time. Asia wasn't just a mother. She was a political strategist who knew that her son's ascent was not guaranteed. Her role wasn't simply to nurture. It was to help craft the political alliances and public perceptions that would ultimately propel Augustus to power. Augustus' early education is often painted as a traditional aristocratic upbringing, learning the ways of Roman law and military strategy. But what the textbooks don't tell you is how ruthless his military education was. Augustus didn't just train for leadership, he lived it. He was already a student of political warfare. The military training he received wasn't about simple strategy, it was about psychological warfare. It wasn't just about leading troops, it was about knowing how to use the loyalty of soldiers as a weapon of mass control. And let's not forget about the role of military force in Augustus' rise. It wasn't just a tool of political consolidation, it was the only tool he trusted. When Augustus returned to Rome after Caesar's assassination, he had no political power to back him. But what he did have was Caesar's army. He didn't simply inherit soldiers. He turned them into a loyal personal force, and he used that loyalty to manipulate not only his rivals but the Senate itself. Here's the final twist. Augustus didn't just become the emperor of Rome, he redefined what it meant to rule an empire. He didn't just ride Caesar's coattails to power. He used Caesar's death as the perfect opportunity to destroy his political enemies, outsmart every rival, and set himself up as the only true leader of Rome. Augustus didn't just conquer lands, he conquered perceptions, manipulating the very way Rome thought about power. The question remains, how many of today's political leaders are crafting their legacy, using their own public images as the ultimate weapon? Just like Augustus, they don't just inherit power, they create it, one calculated move at a time. So, the real question is, are we seeing the rise of a modern Augustus in our world today? Someone who understands that power doesn't come from the people. It comes from controlling the story that the people believe. What if Julius Caesar never died? Would the Roman Empire have risen in the same way? Augustus, Caesar's adopted heir, came to power after the brutal assassination that tore Rome apart. But what if that chaos never happened? Would Augustus have emerged as the leader who transformed a republic into the most powerful empire the world had ever seen? The idea that the empire was inevitable is a lie. Augustus didn't just inherit power, he created it. He turned defeat into victory and chaos into order. The story of Augustus is the story of how one decision, the death of a leader, sparked a fire that would last for millennia. If you think you know the answer, think again. Let's dig deeper into how Augustus manipulated Rome's future and why it matters now more than ever. Let's throw out the idealized version of Roman history you think you know. Picture this. 3 men, Mark Antony, Gaius Octavian, later Augustus, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, coming together in 43 BCE, supposedly to restore order after the murder of Julius Caesar. The reality? It was not an act of heroism or political cooperation. No, it was a dirty power grab, a masterclass in manipulation, violence, and betrayal, and it all began with one simple question. Who gets to control Rome? Sure, you've been told that the Second Triumvirate was a necessary alliance for Rome's survival. But here's the shocking truth, it wasn't about saving Rome. It was about survival at any cost. These three men, who seemed to form a unified front, were actually playing a game so treacherous that the true victor wasn't the one who won the battle, but the one who played his rivals like pawns on a political chessboard. Let's start with the dirty secret behind the so-called alliance between Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus. While history tells us that they came together out of necessity, the real reason for the formation of the Triumvirate was this: a calculated decision to murder and discredit anyone who stood in their way. Octavian didn't just join Antony and Lepidus, he coerced them. He had no military experience, no direct control over Rome, and yet he walked into the political theater like a wolf in sheep's clothing. He was young, ambitious, and most of all, ruthless. Here's the twist: Octavian didn't inherit Caesar's legacy. He used Caesar's death to forge an identity. Antony? He had the military strength, the charisma, and the loyalty of Caesar's legions. But what he lacked was the perception of legitimacy that Octavian had. And Lepidus? He was just a convenient pawn, a figurehead who could be discarded the moment he was no longer useful. The real battle? It was between Octavian and Antony. Lepidus was a mere buffer, quickly swept aside once he outlived his usefulness. Now, let's look at the aftermath of Julius Caesar's assassination. You've probably heard that the political landscape was thrown into chaos. But have you considered this? The assassination was not simply an act of rebellion. It was a grand strategy orchestrated by Octavian and Antony, with a smokescreen of outrage and political vengeance. They didn't just lose Caesar, they seized the opportunity to capitalize on his death. In 43 BCE, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus legally formed the Second Triumvirate, but here's the real twist: it wasn't about restoring the Republic. It was about creating a legal facade for absolute control. The triumvirs were granted extraordinary powers by the Senate, which essentially meant they could do whatever they wanted, without any checks or balances. But instead of leading with public support and military victories, Octavian began his reign by purging anyone who could challenge his claim. And don't be fooled by the idealized version of the proscriptions. Sure, historians like to talk about the lists of enemies marked for death, but let's get real, it was a bloody political purge. The triumvirs used the proscription to settle personal scores, eliminate competitors, and eliminate anyone who was even a potential threat. Brutus and Cassius were just the beginning. Those who had supported Caesar's assassination became their next targets. The bloodbath wasn't about avenging Caesar, it was about consolidating power. Then came the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, a battle that you've probably heard was about avenging Caesar's death. But let's examine it for what it truly was: a tactical slaughter. Octavian and Antony knew that, despite their alliance, they couldn't afford to let Brutus and Cassius continue to pose a threat. So they staged a military showdown, not just to defeat the Republican remnants, but to destroy any hope of restoring the Republic. But here's the real shocker: Octavian almost lost. Cassius, a brilliant tactician, actually won the first phase of the battle. It was only after a series of poor decisions and the strategic disintegration of Brutus' forces that Octavian and Antony secured victory. But here's the thing: they didn't just win for the Republic. They won to solidify their own control. By the time the dust settled at Philippi, the triumvirs were officially in charge. But the cracks in their alliance were already beginning to show. Here's the ultimate irony: despite their military success, the real victor was already emerging, and it wasn't Antony. Octavian, having successfully eliminated Brutus and Cassius, turned his sights on Antony. Octavian, the supposed young heir, was now playing the game of politics with a level of skill that his more experienced allies couldn't match. In the aftermath, Octavian realized something that history often overlooks. The true weapon of power wasn't the sword, it was the perception of power. Antony, too focused on his military triumphs and his relationship with Cleopatra, failed to see the subtle political war that Octavian was waging in Rome. Octavian was constructing a public image of himself as the savior of the Republic, positioning Antony as a traitor to Roman values. In the years that followed, Octavian would use propaganda, military might, and alliances to ultimately crush Antony's influence and take sole control of Rome. So ask yourself, what do we really know about the rise of Augustus? The official story tells us it was about avenging Caesar, consolidating power, and restoring peace to Rome. But what if the truth is far more cynical? What if Augustus was not the savior of Rome, but the architect of a new order that sacrificed the Republic, and the very ideals of Rome itself, for the sake of personal ambition? Would you still call him a hero, or would you see him for what he really was? A man who manipulated every ally, every enemy, and every event to become the undisputed ruler of Rome? This wasn't just history, it was an empire built on the art of deception. And today, as we watch political figures play the same games, the question is, are we witnessing history repeat itself? Did you know Augustus wasn't the first choice to become ruler of Rome? In fact, many thought his path to power was impossible. But he wasn't just Caesar's heir, he was a master of manipulation. Augustus didn't win the Roman Empire through sheer military strength or inherited glory. He used a secret weapon that no one saw coming, his ability to control Rome's narrative. Behind every victory, every triumph, there was a well-crafted image, a political mastermind at work. What does that say about the power of storytelling in politics? If Augustus taught us anything, it's that perception can be more powerful than reality. But how far are leaders willing to go today to control their own story? The answer is more terrifying than you think. Forget everything you've been told about Augustus and Mark Antony. Forget the heroic narrative of one rising to become Rome's first emperor. Because the truth behind their rivalry is far darker, far more manipulative, and utterly brutal. Let's strip away the sugar-coated version of history and expose what really happened in the battle for control over Rome. The narrative you've been fed about Augustus is a lie. The image of the restorer of the Republic, the noble leader who brought peace to Rome, is nothing more than a carefully crafted facade. Augustus didn't rise to power by restoring Rome. He rose by exploiting every weakness, every failure, and every opportunity to destroy his rivals, with Antony being his greatest victim. Augustus didn't just defeat Antony on the battlefield. He didn't need to. He destroyed Antony's reputation first. While Antony was waging battles in the east, falling in love with Cleopatra, and consolidating power with Egypt, Augustus was already winning the war for Rome's mind. He manipulated public opinion with a cunning propaganda campaign that painted Antony as the ultimate traitor, the man who had forsaken Rome for a foreign queen. While Antony was consumed with military conquest, Augustus had already set the stage for his downfall. Let's think about this critically. Why did Antony's relationship with Cleopatra matter so much? On the surface, it seems like a personal romance gone wrong, but in reality, this was a masterstroke of political strategy by Augustus. What if I told you that Cleopatra wasn't just a lover? She was the perfect scapegoat for Augustus. Antony's real enemy wasn't Octavian's armies, it was public perception. And Octavian, more shrewd than any general, realized that the best way to destroy a political rival was not through battle but by turning the people against him. At the heart of their rivalry was not just the control of Rome, but the control of the story. Augustus didn't simply fight for power, he fought for the narrative. He knew that the power to shape how Rome saw its leaders was the real key to ruling the empire. It's easy to say Augustus was victorious at Actium, but that was the final step in a much longer psychological war. While Antony played the role of the military leader, Augustus became Rome's savior, the rightful heir of Caesar, the one who would restore order. All of this was propaganda and it worked perfectly. Let's rewind to 36 BCE. What happened then was pivotal. Augustus had already secured his political base, using Caesar's legacy to manipulate Rome's institutions. But Antony, having been away in the east, had made one crucial mistake. He thought military strength alone could secure his position. He was distracted, arrogant, and failed to recognize that the true battle was not for the military but for the minds of the people. Augustus capitalized on this, using the Senate, the people, and the power of public opinion to turn Roman elites against Antony. By the time the Battle of Actium arrived in 31 BCE, it wasn't just a battle of legions. It was a battle between two competing narratives of what Rome should be. Here's the kicker. Antony's fleet didn't just lose at Actium because of military blunders or Cleopatra's retreat. No, Antony's forces were already defeated long before the first arrow was fired. They were defeated by Augustus' brilliance in playing the political game. By the time Antony sailed to Actium, his image had already been so thoroughly trashed by Augustus that his forces were already disillusioned, lacking morale and loyalty. Meanwhile, Augustus had not only rallied his troops, he had painted himself as the embodiment of Roman virtue, and the true Roman leader. The result? A staggering defeat at Actium that sealed Antony's fate and left Cleopatra scrambling for her life. The final moments of Antony and Cleopatra's suicides are often romanticized as an act of tragedy, but let's be real. These were the deaths of two people who were political pawns, used and discarded by Augustus. While Antony and Cleopatra made their last desperate moves, Augustus was already planning his next step: to consolidate power, sweep aside any remaining opposition, and take full control of Rome. The end of Antony and Cleopatra wasn't just personal, it was political. Their deaths were the final removal of any threat to Augustus' absolute rule. But what if Antony had been more strategic? What if he hadn't allowed himself to be distracted by his love for Cleopatra? Could he have retained his influence and defeated Augustus? Here's the truth: Antony never stood a chance. Augustus was playing a game on a level that Antony could never reach. He wasn't just conquering territories, he was conquering the minds of the people. In the end, it wasn't about the fleet at Actium, it was about who controlled the narrative of Rome's future. So ask yourself, what does this story teach us about power today? Let's be honest, Augustus wasn't a hero. He was a ruthless tactician who played everyone around him. History has sanitized his rise to power, presenting him as the savior of the Republic, but the truth is far more insidious. What if I told you Augustus didn't simply inherit power? He manipulated, eliminated, and controlled every figure and institution in Rome to create the image of a leader who was always destined to rule. In the years following Julius Caesar's assassination, Rome was in chaos. It was not a time of noble sacrifice or democratic restoration. It was a time of ruthless political infighting. Enter Octavian, a young, inexperienced heir to Caesar, who seemingly had no military experience or significant public backing. But what Octavian lacked in experience, he more than made up for in manipulative genius. While Antony was campaigning in the east, distracted by Cleopatra, Octavian was already building a narrative of a rightful heir who was committed to restoring Rome. And while he played the innocent son of Caesar, he was also secretly making every move necessary to destroy his rivals. Here's the kicker. Augustus didn't wait for an opportunity to rise, he created it. Every single move he made was designed to manipulate perception and position him as the sole savior of Rome. His first victory wasn't over a rival, but over public opinion. When Caesar died, the Roman people didn't know who to trust, but Octavian, through calculated speeches and strategic alliances, made himself the only logical successor. He didn't just win favor with the army, he manufactured his own legitimacy through image. But let's break down what happened next, shall we? Octavian's genius wasn't just in military tactics or political alliances, it was in his ability to force the Senate's hand. You think Augustus humbly gave up power? Think again. The Senate didn't bestow the title of princeps on Augustus because they loved him. They had no choice. They were effectively cornered into accepting him as the leader. His move to relinquish power wasn't about sacrifice. It was a calculated move to present himself as the savior while actually solidifying his control. This was no return to republican values. This was a manipulation of Rome's political traditions. He knew that to control Rome, he needed to control the narrative, and he used the Senate as a puppet. The Senate seemed to grant him power, but in truth they had already lost it. By 27 BCE, when Augustus was declared princeps, the Senate was irrelevant. Augustus was not a servant of the people. He was their master, disguised as their servant. His brilliance was not in winning battles, it was in winning the hearts and minds of Rome. Let's dig into his methods. Augustus didn't just govern with military power, he controlled every image of power in Rome. He strategically placed his supporters in key positions within the Senate and military, ensuring that no challenge to his authority could ever gain a foothold. Every military victory, every reform, every law he passed was not for the benefit of Rome, it was for his own legacy. Think about his military reforms. He didn't just create a standing army, he created a personal army loyal only to him. Roman legions were traditionally loyal to their general, but Augustus transformed them into tools of personal power, ensuring that their allegiance was to him and not to the Senate or the people. His control over the army was the final nail in the coffin of the Republic. Augustus didn't need a Senate, he had an army that would enforce his will, and an image that would make any opposition irrelevant. What does that tell you about how power is truly seized? It's not about military conquest or taking control by force. It's about creating a compelling story and making the people believe that you are their savior. Augustus' reforms were a brilliant sleight of hand. He reformed Roman laws, military structures, and even social norms. But these changes were designed to mask the transition from republic to empire. He didn't simply restore Rome's greatness. He redefined it and redefined what it meant to rule. He didn't just conquer territories, he conquered perceptions. The true shock of Augustus' rise is that it wasn't just a battle between rivals. It was a masterclass in manipulation. The Senate, the people, and even his enemies were all part of his game, unknowingly working toward his final goal. The true tragedy of the Roman Republic was that it wasn't overthrown by one man's military prowess, but by one man's ability to rewrite the rules of governance. Think about that for a second. Could it be that today's leaders, whether in business, politics, or even entertainment, are playing the exact same game? Could it be that the true seat of power is not in what we think we're seeing, but in the image that is carefully crafted for us? Augustus was a genius at this, and he wasn't just playing for Rome, he was playing for all of human history. So the next time you hear about the rise of Augustus, remember this: it wasn't a rise at all, it was a perfectly crafted descent into the heart of political power. The Republic wasn't restored. It was obliterated. Forget what you've been told about Augustus. Forget the sanitized version of him as the benevolent savior who brought peace and prosperity to Rome. The truth is darker, more manipulative, and more shocking than anyone has ever led you to believe. What if I told you Augustus didn't bring peace to Rome? He engineered peace by destroying his rivals, rewriting history, and using the full might of Roman propaganda to shape his image as the sole hero of Rome's story. You think Augustus was a hero? Think again. He was a master manipulator who exploited every moment of weakness in Rome's political system. When Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, there was no good guy who stepped in to save the Republic. There was only opportunist Octavian, a young, inexperienced political player who knew exactly what he needed to do to seize power, and he did it by playing every faction off one another. The first thing you need to understand is that Augustus didn't inherit power. He took it. Every single step of his rise was carefully orchestrated, and the biggest weapon in his arsenal wasn't his army, his reforms, or his public speeches. It was image control. Let's strip away the facade and get to the core of Augustus' true power: his mastery over propaganda. The so-called Pax Romana, or Roman peace, is often presented as the golden era of stability and prosperity under Augustus. But here's the truth: it wasn't peace at all. It was fear masked as peace. Augustus didn't restore the Republic. He eliminated it quietly and efficiently. Rome had peace because Augustus was the only one left standing after he'd crushed every potential challenger, turned allies into subservient pawns, and used the Roman military not just for expansion but to enforce his personal rule. You think the Pax Romana was about diplomacy and building alliances? It was about Augustus securing a system where only he had the power to declare peace or war. It was a glorious dictatorship disguised as a republic, and Augustus knew exactly how to sell it to the people. He used the military to crush resistance, then used his control over public perception to make it look like he was restoring order. Augustus was the very definition of rule through fear, and Roman peace came at a price: the obliteration of political opposition. Sure, Augustus built a powerful military, but he didn't build it to protect Rome. He built it to protect himself. The so-called professional Roman army wasn't just about defending borders, it was about securing personal loyalty. Augustus didn't create a military to defend Rome's citizens. He created a military that would fight and die for him alone. In reality, Augustus' military reforms were as much about centralizing power as they were about defense. He created a standing army loyal to the emperor, and he put military loyalty in the hands of his closest supporters. What does that mean? It meant the army wasn't loyal to Rome, it was loyal to Augustus, and this was the foundation of his control. But it wasn't just about the standing legions. Augustus also created the Praetorian Guard, which became his personal enforcers, a secret police who would ensure that no senator or general could ever challenge him. The Praetorian Guard wasn't a symbol of Roman peace. It was a symbol of Augustus' control over both the army and the political system. Without the Guard, Augustus would have never been able to consolidate his power in the way he did. What you're not told about Augustus' territorial expansion is that it wasn't just about growing the empire, it was about gaining legitimacy. You see, the expansion of the Roman Empire wasn't an inevitability, it was a strategic move designed to boost Augustus' image as a powerful, capable ruler. Every military victory, every conquest wasn't about Rome's glory, it was about Augustus' political image. Take Egypt, for example. Yes, Augustus conquered Egypt, but that wasn't just about territory, it was about controlling wealth and securing resources to ensure that Augustus could fund his projects and buy the loyalty of key allies. Egypt wasn't just a province, it was a personal asset, and Augustus understood that controlling Egypt meant controlling Rome's wealth. It was a political masterstroke, but no one talks about that part of the conquest. His conquests in Spain, Gaul, and the Balkans were similarly strategic, designed to solidify his power within Rome's military structure. Sure, the empire grew, but every expansion was designed to make Augustus look like a hero, a protector of Roman honor. The reality? He needed those victories to shore up support within the empire, especially from military elites. Without them, he would have had nothing to maintain his facade as a legitimate ruler. The city of Rome didn't just become a city of marble under Augustus. It became a political tool. The famous phrase, "I found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble," is often cited as a symbol of Augustus' love for his city, but in reality, it was a deliberate political move to cement his legacy. Every building, every monument, every public space was designed to serve Augustus' image. Augustus knew that for Rome's elites and citizens, architecture wasn't just about functionality, it was about perception. He commissioned temples to Roman gods, forums to showcase the greatness of Rome, and public buildings that glorified the peace he had restored. The Era Pacis, a massive altar to peace, was more than just a religious monument. It was a visual testament to Augustus' claim that he was the savior of Rome. Every public work under Augustus wasn't just for the city, it was for himself. He wasn't just building Rome. He was building a legacy, one that would be tied to his image for centuries. The city of Rome became his personal advertisement, and every stone was a piece of his political propaganda. Augustus didn't just reform Rome's politics. He reformed its culture, and not for the benefit of Rome but for his own power. The Lex Julia laws, aimed at encouraging marriage and family life, weren't about improving Roman society, they were about controlling the elite. By forcing the aristocracy to marry and produce children, Augustus ensured the loyalty of the Roman elite and solidified his control over Roman morality. In addition, his moral legislation wasn't about Roman virtue. It was about creating a society that was loyal to Augustus' vision. By ensuring that the Roman elite followed his standards of behavior, Augustus created an environment where dissent could be stamped out without ever appearing authoritarian. The facade of virtue hid a much darker reality. Augustus was using social control to enforce his absolute dominance. So, what does the story of Augustus truly reveal? The truth is, Augustus wasn't just a man of military brilliance or political genius. He was a master of manipulation, image control, and strategic destruction. His reign wasn't about peace. It was about subjugation, subjugating the Senate, the military, and the Roman people to his vision of rule. Augustus didn't restore the Republic, he destroyed it. And in doing so, he created an empire that lasted for centuries, all while wearing the mask of a republican savior. His reign is a testament to the power of perception, and how one man, through manipulation and control, can shape the destiny of a civilization. How many leaders today are following the exact same blueprint? Creating controlled narratives, building their personal legacies, and manipulating public perception to secure absolute power, without anyone realizing it until it's too late? Augustus wasn't just the first emperor of Rome, he was the first to truly understand how to rule through perception, not just force. And that is a lesson that still echoes in the halls of power today. Let's take a deeper dive into Augustus' true legacy, stripping away the veil of glory and brilliance that has been draped around his name for centuries. You've heard the sanitized version, the first emperor who brought peace and stability to Rome, securing his power through reforms and military genius. But here's the truth you won't find in most history books. Augustus was not a peacekeeper. He wasn't a protector of the Roman Republic. He was the mastermind behind its quiet destruction, and he did it with such crafty manipulation, psychological warfare, and subtle deception that even the Senate, and history itself, fell for it. What if I told you Augustus didn't just defeat Mark Antony and Cleopatra? He destroyed them by rewriting their stories in the public consciousness. What if Augustus didn't restore Rome's republic, but redefined what power and loyalty meant, making himself the sole arbiter of truth? You've been told that Augustus restored peace, but let's be real. He didn't restore anything. He created the illusion of peace by doing the one thing the Roman Republic could never do: eliminate any trace of opposition, consolidate total control, and make it seem like a return to tradition. Here's the dark truth that will shock you. Augustus didn't create the Roman Empire out of military conquest or republican reform. He manufactured it, piece by piece, rebuilding Rome in his image. He didn't just inherit the empire from Caesar. He manipulated every political ally, every military commander, and even every institution to make himself appear as Rome's savior. His real genius wasn't in warfare, it was in convincing everyone, including his enemies, that he was the only man fit to rule. You think Augustus just cleaned up Rome? No, he obliterated anyone who could stand in his way. The purges weren't just about political rivals. They were about leaving no trace of potential opposition. He didn't simply execute, he erased entire political factions. While the history books talk about the elimination of Lepidus and Antony's supporters, what they don't tell you is that Augustus wasn't just eliminating a threat, he was securing his narrative. Lepidus, once a member of the Second Triumvirate, was crushed almost without resistance. His exile wasn't just about removing a rival, it was about removing any potential memory of a time when Rome's power structures weren't in Augustus' hands. But the real shocker comes when we talk about Mark Antony. His defeat at the Battle of Actium wasn't the end of Augustus' campaign. His true victory was in the propaganda war that Augustus waged against Antony and Cleopatra. Antony wasn't just a political rival. He became a symbol of everything that was wrong with Rome: excessive luxury, foreign influence, and weak leadership. Augustus didn't just defeat Antony, he redefined him, turning Antony from a capable general into a traitor to Rome. What did Augustus do? He used every weapon at his disposal, not just the sword but the pen and the mind. Antony's affair with Cleopatra wasn't a personal matter, it was propaganda gold. Augustus painted Antony as a man who had abandoned Rome for a foreign queen. He sold Rome's people the idea that Antony wasn't just defeated. He was an existential threat to Roman values. The real tragedy? Rome bought it, and Augustus' critics were silenced before they could even get started. Now, let's talk about Augustus' relationship with the Senate, and by relationship I mean total manipulation. History calls Augustus a restorer of the Republic, but here's the shocker. He didn't restore anything. What he did was create a facade of republicanism that allowed him to appear as a humble servant of the people, while actually consolidating absolute power. When Augustus took power, he knew the Republic's image was too strong to be destroyed openly. So, he did the next best thing. He kept the Senate intact but turned it into a puppet. Augustus didn't restore the Senate's powers. He made the Senate his tool, ensuring that every law passed, every decision made, and every vote cast was ultimately in his favor. When Augustus officially gave up power in 27 BCE and the Senate granted him the title of princeps, he never gave up anything. What they gave him was the ability to appear like a servant of Rome, while he controlled everything. This wasn't the Senate's decision, it was Augustus' design. By letting the Senate believe they were still in control, Augustus ensured they would never challenge him. The Senate's legitimacy was now tied to Augustus, and they would never be able to operate outside his influence. One of the most chilling aspects of Augustus' rise to power was his ability to create a narrative and make his enemies disappear from history. His propaganda war against Cleopatra and Antony didn't just shape the public perception, it shaped the future of Rome. Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, wasn't just an opponent, she was the perfect villain. Augustus needed to portray her as the epitome of everything that threatened Roman virtue. So he crafted the image of a queen who used Antony as her pawn, plotting to overthrow Rome's greatness. The fact that Augustus won the military battle at Actium is secondary. What really secured his power was how he painted Antony and Cleopatra as dangerous to Rome's existence. The narrative he created was that Antony had betrayed Rome, and Cleopatra, a foreign queen, was pulling the strings. What's shocking is how effectively Augustus controlled the narrative. Through monuments, speeches, and coinage, Augustus turned their relationship into a symbol of corruption. While Antony and Cleopatra were publicly humiliated, Augustus stood untouched as the defender of Roman values. This manipulation didn't just win him the battle, it changed history. The paradox of Augustus is that he wasn't just the first emperor of Rome. He was the architect of a new kind of power, one that ruled through perception, manipulation, and psychological warfare. While history paints him as a wise, benevolent ruler, the reality is that Augustus shaped every aspect of Roman governance to serve his interests. He didn't just conquer territories, he conquered the people's minds. His rise was built not just on military victories, but on his ability to frame the narrative of Rome's future. By the time Augustus passed away in 14 CE, he had created an empire where loyalty to the emperor wasn't just expected. It was culturally ingrained, and any attempt to challenge it had been systematically removed. Augustus didn't just win the Roman world. He redefined what it meant to hold power, and in doing so he secured a legacy that still echoes today. What if I told you that Augustus didn't just manipulate the Senate, the military, and the people of Rome? What if I told you he manipulated his own family, his health issues, and even his personal relationships in a deliberate and calculated way to secure his empire? Augustus wasn't just an emperor. He was the architect of perception, the master manipulator who crafted every single aspect of his life to reinforce his grip on power. You think Augustus was simply a wise ruler, using his family, his health, and his personal life in an innocent way to solidify his reign? Let's peel back the layers of this carefully constructed image and look at the real Augustus, the one who used personal loyalty, family manipulation, and health struggles to control Rome. Augustus' marriages weren't about love, they were about control. His first marriage to Scribonia? It wasn't about affection. Scribonia was a political tool, a woman married to Augustus to create an alliance with her influential family. Augustus never loved her. He saw her as a vessel for his dynastic ambitions. But when she failed to provide him with a male heir, an act of failure in his eyes, she was discarded. He divorced her almost immediately despite her giving him a daughter, Julia. It wasn't personal, it was political. Augustus needed more than just children. He needed the right alliances. Then came Livia Drusilla, whom he married after falling in love with her. But, more importantly, she was an asset politically and strategically. In Livia, Augustus found not only a loyal companion but a woman who would cement his dynastic legacy. You think Livia's role was just as a wife? No. Livia was his partner in crime, the brains behind the dynasty. She was as much about political power as any military victory Augustus achieved. Together they forged an empire, and Livia's sons, particularly Tiberius, would inherit what Augustus had built. But here's the kicker: Augustus didn't just trust his wife. He used her, manipulated her, even when it came to his own biological son, Tiberius. Augustus never fully trusted Tiberius, and though Tiberius was adopted by Augustus, he was exiled and manipulated into serving Augustus' vision of the dynasty. Augustus played his family like a game of chess, and each move was calculated to secure his empire's future, not just for his reign but for the bloodline he created. Let's talk about Julia, Augustus' daughter. She was more than just a scandal. She was a key piece in Augustus' grand political puzzle. Augustus, a man obsessed with Roman morality, made an example out of Julia. What? Julia became a threat to Augustus' moral vision, but it wasn't just about her behavior. It was about control. Augustus' laws, particularly the Lex Julia, weren't about saving Roman families. They were about ensuring loyalty to his rule. Julia's relationships with men, which were seen as a personal rebellion, weren't just public scandals. They were a direct challenge to Augustus' narrative that he was the moral leader of Rome. By exiling his own daughter, Augustus created a personal sacrifice that would enforce his image as morally unyielding, but at the cost of his own flesh and blood. This wasn't a moral choice, it was a calculated political decision. Augustus' public morality was a tool. Julia, his own daughter, was exiled not just to punish her but to send a message to Rome. Augustus wasn't just a ruler, he was the moral compass of the empire. Even family was expendable in the pursuit of power. But here's what they don't tell you: Augustus' moral laws like the Lex Julia weren't about purity, they were about creating a loyal citizenry. By punishing his own daughter for failing to uphold his vision of Roman family values, Augustus ensured that no one in Rome, not even his own bloodline, was exempt from his control. The moral order Augustus projected was simply a performance, an act to solidify his autocratic power. You know about Augustus' chronic health problems, but let's talk about how he used them. Augustus was often sick. Chronic stomach issues, severe exhaustion, and even disfigurement from illness. He wasn't just a sick man. He was a sick man who understood the power of his illness. Augustus knew that weakness could become strength. He knew how to play the role of the suffering ruler, the man who bore his burdens for Rome. His chronic ailments weren't just personal struggles. They were tools of public manipulation. By downplaying his sickness, Augustus created an image of resilience and divine strength. His poor health became an opportunity to reinforce his image as a ruler who, despite his suffering, remained steadfast and dedicated to Rome. People didn't see Augustus as a fragile, sick ruler. They saw him as a divinely chosen leader, someone who was willing to sacrifice his own health for the good of the empire. But here's the twist. Augustus' health issues were not just unfortunate misfortunes. They were opportunities. Every time he was seen struggling with illness, it served a greater purpose. It was the perfect cover for his manipulations, the ultimate masking of political ruthlessness with an image of divine resilience. His suffering made him more relatable, more human, which in turn made him unassailable as a ruler. Now let's talk about Augustus' obsession with omens, augury, and superstitions. Augustus didn't just rule Rome, he shaped Rome's belief system. He used omens to craft a divinely ordained narrative about his rise to power, framing every battle, every triumph, every act of governance as evidence of divine favor. He didn't just believe in the gods, he used them to manipulate the public. Augustus' reliance on omens and augury wasn't about piety, it was about securing his political destiny. Every military victory, every successful political move was tied to a divine omen, and Augustus crafted his public image as divinely chosen. His use of these superstitions wasn't spiritual, it was strategic. By aligning himself with divine will, Augustus ensured that his actions were beyond reproach. The gods, he claimed, were on his side, making any criticism of his rule seem not just unpatriotic but blasphemous. And don't forget the divinization of Augustus after his death. He wasn't just an emperor. He was a god, a living deity, elevated by his own manipulation of divine signs and religious symbolism. This wasn't just about legacy, it was about immortality. Augustus manipulated the divine to make himself eternal. So let's rethink what we know about Augustus. The man who is often portrayed as the savior of Rome and the architect of the Roman Empire wasn't just a political genius. He was a master of psychological warfare, a shrewd manipulator, and a self-made god. Every marriage, every family relationship, every sick day, and every propaganda campaign was carefully orchestrated to serve his ultimate goal: total control. Augustus didn't just rule through power, he ruled through perception. He wasn't a ruler who just created an empire. He constructed his own divine myth, which became the foundation of the Roman Empire's power for centuries to come. The real question is, how many of today's leaders are playing the same game, manipulating perception, creating their own myths, and quietly securing their reign? Augustus understood that true power is not about controlling armies, it's about controlling what people believe. And that's the most dangerous weapon of all. What if I told you that everything we've been taught about Augustus is a carefully constructed lie? That the man who brought peace to Rome, who transformed the city into marble, and who redefined the Roman Empire, wasn't just a brilliant statesman but a master manipulator, using every part of his personal life, his health, his family, and even his own suffering as tools of political control? Here's the truth. Augustus didn't just inherit power. He created it through manipulation, psychological warfare, and the elimination of every threat to his reign. What he left behind wasn't just a city of marble, it was a legacy of deception, carefully engineered through every word he spoke and every decision he made. Augustus wasn't just building an empire, he was shaping the very narrative of his own divinity, and in doing so, he created a legacy that would be immortalized for millennia. Let's look at Augustus' most famous quotes, the ones he used to shroud his true intentions. "I found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble." Everyone loves this quote. It's the hallmark of Augustus' supposed generosity and vision. He took a broken city and transformed it into a monumental, marble-clad empire. But let's dig deeper. What if this wasn't just about aesthetics? What if this wasn't merely a symbol of empire building, but a metaphor for Augustus' own political strategy? The real transformation wasn't about marble, it was about the reconstruction of Rome's political identity. Augustus didn't just rebuild the city's structures. He rebuilt Roman power structures to reflect his complete control. He understood that public perception is everything in politics. By building monumental public works, he crafted an image of himself as the savior of Rome. The marble buildings, temples, and forums weren't just for the people. They were for Augustus' own propaganda. Rome was not just transformed physically, it was restructured politically. Augustus took a city of bricks, representing the old, chaotic republic, and made it a city of marble, representing his new imperial order, with him at the center. Every stone in the city was a testament to his divine right to rule. The city of marble was a symbol of his eternal legacy, and Augustus wasn't just building a capital, he was building a godlike identity. Make haste slowly, the perfect political paradox. At first glance, the phrase "make haste slowly" seems like a paradox, a leadership style that balances urgency with caution. But let's break this down further. What if Augustus didn't just practice patience? What if he weaponized it? What if his slow, deliberate approach to power wasn't just about strategic caution, but about psychological warfare, making his enemies believe they had time to act, only to strike when they least expected it? Augustus didn't rush into reforms, military campaigns, or alliances. He took precise, calculated steps to secure his absolute power. He let others think they were in control while he methodically eliminated rivals and safeguarded his legacy. Make haste slowly wasn't just about politics, it was about playing the long game. It's a strategy of false security, keeping his rivals complacent, making them think they had time to challenge him, only to crush them when they least expected it. I am a man who has been obliged to create the circumstances of his own fortune. This quote reflects Augustus' self-made status, or so it seems. But what if I told you that Augustus wasn't simply creating circumstances? He was designing the very environment that allowed him to seize power at every turn. Augustus didn't just rise to power by chance. He manufactured every opportunity, every alliance, and every moment of political gain. In reality, Augustus' self-made fortune wasn't just luck. It was ruthless calculation. The battles he fought, the friends he made, the alliances he forged were all tools he used to reshape the Roman world in his image. His fortune wasn't built on his strength alone. It was built on eliminating rivals, manipulating perception, and controlling the narrative of Roman destiny. The phrase, "create the circumstances of his own fortune," is, in fact, a declaration of his total control over fate, not just for himself but for Rome itself. I wish to leave a peaceable world for my descendants. The noble Augustus, looking out for his descendants, right? Wrong. Let's reframe this. This statement about leaving a peaceable world was a political calculation disguised as paternalism. Augustus didn't just want peace for Rome's future. He wanted to secure his legacy and ensure the continued supremacy of his dynasty. The Pax Romana wasn't simply about peace, it was about controlling the future. Augustus was obsessed with creating a lasting empire, not just through conquest, but through dynastic succession. By speaking of peace, he was ensuring that his family would continue to rule, and his vision of imperial authority would endure beyond his lifetime. The peaceable world he left behind was one where his descendants, specifically Tiberius, would inherit an empire carefully crafted to ensure absolute loyalty to his lineage. Let's pull back the curtain on Augustus the man and not just the emperor. Augustus was a political genius, but not in the way most historians portray him. His rise to power wasn't just about military conquest. It was about controlling the perception of reality. He manipulated his image, crafted his own narrative, and used every aspect of his life, from his marriages to his health, to ensure that Rome would only remember him as the divine ruler who brought peace to the empire. Augustus didn't just win Rome. He controlled the narrative of history itself. By creating a world where he was the only possible savior, he secured his empire and legacy for centuries. His genius wasn't just in military strategy or governance, it was in making his enemies believe they were part of the plan, even as he methodically erased them from history. So let me ask you, who controls the narrative of your world? The past is never as it seems, and Augustus proved that the greatest power in any society isn't its military, its economy, or its politics. It's its story. Augustus didn't just rule Rome. He ruled the story of Rome, and in doing so he created an empire that still looms over history to this day. You can't escape history, but you can make it. What if I told you Augustus wasn't just the architect of the Roman Empire, but a man who meticulously manipulated every element of Roman society to craft his own immortal legacy? That the empire he built wasn't just about stability, peace, and prosperity, it was about his peace, his prosperity, and most importantly, his absolute control over Rome and its history? We all know the story. The first emperor of Rome, the man who brought peace to a fractured empire. But what if that's not the real story? What if the true legacy of Augustus wasn't the Roman Empire itself, but the carefully constructed myth that he was destined to rule and that his empire was fated for greatness? What if Augustus wasn't just leading Rome, but writing the story of his reign from the very beginning, rewriting history to ensure no one would ever challenge his legacy? Let's strip away the propaganda and uncover the shocking truth about the man who set the foundation for a global empire, using deception, psychological manipulation, and ruthless political control. The real Augustus wasn't just a statesman. He was a master of controlling perception, and here's how he did it. The city of marble wasn't just about aesthetic transformation. It was a political smokescreen. We all know the famous quote, "I found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble." But here's the real story. Augustus didn't just rebuild Rome's physical city. He rebuilt Rome's identity through the very bricks and marble he used. That marble wasn't just about creating beauty, it was about creating a facade, a symbol of his eternal reign. Augustus shaped the city to reflect his own vision, transforming it into a monument to himself, one that future generations would see as a reminder of his divine rule. What Augustus did with that marble was manipulate public perception. He didn't just build public works for the people, he built symbols of his power. Every column, every statue, every public building was a tool of propaganda, designed to make the people see him as the divinely ordained ruler. The marble wasn't just a material, it was a cultural weapon, used to reinforce the idea that Rome was destined for greatness under Augustus' rule. You think he was just a brilliant architect? No. He was a master of political propaganda, shaping Rome's very identity to reflect his vision. and ensuring his place in history as the greatest ruler Rome ever had. Make haste slowly, the strategy of psychological warfare. Make haste slowly, it sounds like sage advice, right? But here's the reality. Augustus didn't just practice patience, he weaponized it. He understood the power of time, and how it could be used to crush his rivals and make them believe they had control, only to have them fall into his carefully laid traps. Augustus was never in a rush to act, because he knew that his greatest power lay in making his enemies believe they had time to challenge him, even as he consolidated power. When he took control after Caesar's assassination, he didn't rush into overt action. Instead, he let the rival factions bicker and fight amongst themselves, all while he methodically built alliances, gathered power, and manipulated public perception. The quote about making haste slowly isn't just political wisdom, it's a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. Augustus knew that rushing into decisions would make him seem reckless, so he made sure to slowly build his power, creating a false sense of security for his opponents. He didn't act quickly, he acted strategically, and when the time came, his rivals were already too entangled in his schemes to stop him. I am a man who has been obliged to create the circumstances of his own fortune. This quote isn't just an acknowledgement of self-made success, it's Augustus' realization of the power of control. Let's reframe this. Augustus didn't just create his own fortune. He created every circumstance that would allow him to seize and hold on to power. His rise wasn't based on luck or divine favor, it was based on ruthless manipulation of every situation he found himself in. From the moment Caesar died, Augustus knew that power in Rome was up for grabs, and he took every opportunity to manufacture his own path to the throne. He didn't just create circumstances, he engineered them. Every battle, every alliance, and every public speech was designed to give him an edge, even if that meant using family ties, political manipulation, and the elimination of rivals to secure his position. Augustus understood that to create his fortune, he had to control the narrative at all costs. He didn't just want to rule Rome, he wanted to reshape history. And he did it by controlling every moment, every decision, and even every narrative, ensuring that his rise was seen as inevitable, not by his enemies but by Rome itself. I wish to leave a peaceable world for my descendants. This one's a doozy. Leave a peaceable world for my descendants? It sounds noble, doesn't it? But let's break it down. Augustus didn't just want peace for his people. He didn't want peace for Rome's prosperity. He wanted peace so that his bloodline could inherit a stable empire. The Pax Romana wasn't just about the absence of war. It was about creating a stable empire that could be controlled long after Augustus' death. The peace he left behind was a peace that ensured his family's dominance, not just for his lifetime but for generations. By stabilizing Rome, Augustus ensured that his family would reign, and that any potential challengers to his bloodline would be neutralized. Let's not sugarcoat it. Augustus didn't want peace for the people of Rome, he wanted dynastic peace. This was a political move to ensure his dynasty's continuation, so that his heirs could inherit a world where they would not only rule unchallenged, but would also be seen as divinely chosen rulers. This was not about the world's peace, this was about Augustus' lasting control over the empire. You've heard the stories. Augustus, the benevolent ruler who brought peace, prosperity, and greatness to Rome. But what if the truth is darker, more manipulative than we've been taught? What if Augustus didn't just create an empire? What if he created a legacy of manipulation, one that subjugated the truth itself? Augustus wasn't just a political genius, He was a master of controlling public perception. Through his carefully constructed propaganda, his systematic elimination of rivals, and his manipulation of public suffering, his health issues, his family dynamics, and his political moves, Augustus crafted an empire that wasn't built on strength alone but on the careful construction of his own myth. How many leaders today are following in Augustus' footsteps? How many are using psychological warfare, propaganda, and manipulated narratives to secure their reigns, ensuring that their legacy will endure, just as Augustus did? The story of Augustus is not just the story of Rome, it's the story of how to control history itself. What if I told you his reign wasn't about restoring order to Rome, but about seizing absolute power, crafting his own myth, and obliterating any threat to his legacy? Let's look beyond the marble columns and poetic eulogies. Let's explore the truth of how Augustus engineered his empire. The city of marble. Not just transformation, but manipulation. When Augustus said, "I found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble," he wasn't just talking about aesthetics, he was talking about creating an empire that would outlast him. What you're not told is that this wasn't merely about beautifying the city, it was about creating a lasting image of his reign. Augustus didn't just rebuild Rome. He reconstructed the very foundation of Roman identity. Every marble building, every monument, was a symbol of his control. The transition from brick to marble wasn't just for beauty, it was for immortality. Augustus built his empire with the intention of shaping the future, ensuring that future generations would see his reign as the zenith of Roman glory. His public works weren't just civic improvements, they were divinely sanctioned symbols of his greatness, and anyone who opposed him was erased from the narrative. This transformation of Rome wasn't just about architecture. It was about changing Rome's story, making sure it was his story that was immortalized in stone. Make haste slowly, Augustus' weapon of psychological warfare. You think the phrase "make haste slowly" is a piece of political wisdom, don't you? But let's take a deeper look. Augustus didn't just practice patience, he weaponized it. He knew that time was the most potent tool in political warfare. By moving slowly, Augustus made his enemies think they had time to act, only to strike decisively when they were most vulnerable. Augustus was a master of psychological manipulation. He understood that while he could build alliances, he could also wait for his rivals to make mistakes. He let his political opponents, whether they were his family members or political rivals, believe that they were in control. But in reality, every move Augustus made was a carefully calculated step toward absolute domination. This wasn't about rushing. This was about mastering the art of patience, playing the long game while everyone else acted impulsively. What Augustus understood was that time made people complacent. His rivals, even when they thought they had power, were simply following the script that Augustus had written for them. His ability to wait and bide his time wasn't a virtue, it was a weapon. And when his opponents least expected it, Augustus destroyed them, whether through military conquest, political alliances, or personal betrayals. This wasn't wisdom, it was calculated manipulation. I am a man who has been obliged to create the circumstances of his own fortune. This quote reveals a dark truth about Augustus. He wasn't just a man of opportunity, he was a man who engineered every opportunity. Augustus didn't wait for things to fall into his lap. He created his own fortune through ruthless means. Every battle, every alliance, and every act of diplomacy was crafted by Augustus himself, and every rival he had was either manipulated or destroyed. What's not often told is that Augustus didn't just inherit power. He forged it through calculated violence and psychological warfare. The civil wars were not just a means to an end, they were a method of elimination, a strategy where anyone who could threaten Augustus' future was either bought off, manipulated, or eradicated. His political career was built on the backs of those he crushed, and he made sure that no one who stood in his way would ever be remembered. By claiming to have created the circumstances of his own fortune, Augustus was admitting to the manipulation and ruthless tactics he used to build his empire. The story of Augustus was never about destiny, it was about his calculated rise to the throne, where every action was preordained by his will to control Rome's future. Discover the untold truth behind Augustus' reign and how he manipulated history itself. Don't miss out on understanding the strategies that built an empire. Click now and uncover the legacy that shaped the world we live in today.